This is the Neurosurgery Podcast. Welcome back to the Neurosurgery Podcast. Today we are joined by returning champion, Michael Johnson. Michael's on the show first back in June, I believe, of this year, talking about physician contracts, a specialty of his. And we, at the time, discussed having him come back and talk about negotiations, which obviously are very important during the contract phase of hiring, but also, I imagine, throughout the course of employment for a physician anywhere, hospital, clinic, you name it. We'll link to everything in the show notes again, including the last episode. Michael's firm is called Michael Johnson Legal. He's got a phenomenal Instagram called Physician Contracts that's full of information for all this stuff. We'll plug it for everybody. For now, Michael, welcome back to the show. Take a moment and say hello in case anybody missed the first episode.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me back, and I appreciate the opportunity. I have a law firm, 4 lawyers. We represent physicians across the country navigating all of the different contracts that y'all sign. Okay, y'all basically always have a contract between you and your work, and it's our job to help you understand them, understand what you're required to do, how you're getting paid, and how to get out if you want or they want to get out. But it's really fun practice, and I enjoy chatting about it, obviously. So thank you.
Great. I remember last time we talked about The Firm, a phenomenal movie, and I guess today we'll get into a little bit of Godfather, Make an Offer You Can't Refuse. But let's begin at the beginning. So, I'm going in, I'm applying for a job. Maybe it's the first contact I've had with the hospital or the group. It's just you're my counsel. When does the negotiation really begin? At what point am I in a negotiating mindset?
Yeah, very good. I think that the whole process starts right away. Okay. Don't think of it as like, okay, I don't have to worry about anything until I get a contract in hand and I'll hire a lawyer to do the negotiation. That is not the right strategy here. Really starts with your first communications with that employer. Can you demonstrate that you are a thoughtful professional, that you're organized, that you're timely, that you're a good communicator, that you understand what questions to ask during the interview process, how to understand the job? Are you demonstrating that this is someone who we want to work with indefinitely? I think it's important in every practice setting, but particularly in private practice pre-ownership. Okay. If folks are evaluating you with the potential that they're going to co-own their business, aka their other baby with you, then they want to know that you are a thoughtful professional, that you're not just a surgeon, that you also understand how to collect yourself. So I'd be my advice is to understand some of the key issues about physician contracts. Talk with your mentor so you get an idea of what their experiences have been during the interview process. Prepare yourself in advance before you even get started. This is like pre-interview discussion, right? But be informed on key issues so that you can talk confidently during the interview process better than others. So,
So,
JP,
Michael,
you've actually done probably a great training by having a podcast that talks about all these things. You're probably way ahead of the game. I was on another podcast, quick story, where they said, like, hey, we just wanted to learn a bunch of stuff about business. And, like, we'd call CEOs, CFOs, and they really would call us back. And they said, hey, could you come on our podcast and talk about, hospital finance? They're like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So good work on the podcast.
Well, I'm getting free legal advice, right? And it's all recorded.
Michael, that's a great plug for listening to our podcast. But I want to hit a couple different areas because people have different interests, right, in neurosurgery. And I want to start with the private practice side, and maybe you can help educate. What does it really mean? If you're looking to join a private group, let's call it a group, right? The concept of partnership, everybody makes such a big deal, like I can be partner quickly, or it takes a long time, is there even a thing that is partnership even a real thing, or is it an imaginary thing? It's like being full professor, assistant professor, associate professor. Does it really mean anything? What is a burgeoning young surgeon going to do in terms of, like, should I negotiate for that? How quickly should it come, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so partnership in a private equity company is very different. It's really not ownership, okay? It probably means that you are getting a better comp model, and it doesn't mean that you own the place, okay? physicians use the term partner in hospital employed to mean they're like trusted colleague. It's more of like a term of endearment, of respect, right? But it is not ownership of the hospital. Okay. When you're in private practice in a pre-ownership opportunity, then they're really talking about ownership. When they say my partner, talking about co-owning a business together. So it's an important clarification here, because folks will go like, well, I'll make partners. Like, well, if it's not a pre-ownership track with a private practice that doesn't have private equity involved, then it doesn't mean what you think it means. So that's a good starting place. When we're looking at becoming an owner, let's use the term owner instead of partner. Okay. We're looking at becoming an owner of a private practice. What you're typically going to experience is around 1 to 4 years of work. Okay. Everyone focuses on years, but it's really about money. Let's be real. If your practice has grown fast enough and you are making them money, I think that there are opportunities to shorten this. And we'll talk about that as a negotiation tactic at the employment contract stage. But what you'll be doing is asking them to buy a piece of the practice. Okay, if they own an ambulatory surgery center, then you're often trying to buy a piece of that as well. You also will, when you buy in, if they own real estate, you'll almost certainly want to buy into the real estate assets that house their clinic, that house the ASC, that house whatever else they do. Okay, and then you have like ancillary revenue streaming off everything else that is done in the practice, and you'll want ownership of that. What ownership means is that, what it typically means is, let's say you have a group of 4 owners. Okay, they'll take the overhead of the practice and typically split it evenly between the 4 owners, and you are responsible for covering that overhead. Okay, some practices will like move it around a little bit depending on individual volume. So if one is doing a lot of volume, they're going to pay a little bit more overhead. Someone's doing a little bit less, they're going to pay a little bit less. But the prevailing method here is understanding, okay, we're probably splitting this overhead evenly. Okay, might want to know how much that is. And then typically how the practice ownership works is that any profits above your overhead allocation are like 100% yours, maybe 90% yours. Maybe they hold back a little bit for something that is collective. Most of these models are more of like a pure capitalistic side of the spectrum, where if you do a lot, you're going to make a lot. If you do a little, you're not going to make very much. If you don't cover your overhead, you're going to make zero. Okay. Very, very rarely are these practices a more socialized model where everyone makes exactly the same regardless of individual volume. So a lot of times it's gonna hinge on your individual volume when we're talking about ownership of the practice. Typically, when you're buying into just the practice, the buy-in might not be very expensive. It might just be based on book value of the practice. But if you're buying into real estate, you're buying into ASC, you're buying into other ancillary revenues, then that's going to be very valuable. And it's not crazy for a neurosurgeon buying into a independent physician-owned private practice to expect to pay a 7-figure number if all of those things are in place. Okay, so that's kind of the future, right? Now, backing into negotiating the employment agreement from the start. Okay, very rarely, if ever, are they going to guarantee you ownership in the future. Don't walk in expecting that. I'm an owner of a business, a small professional services company. Okay, I would never guarantee anybody ownership that I haven't worked with before, and they're going to be the same. All right. Yeah. But often there is a clause in the contract that speaks to when ownership will be discussed in good faith. That can be helpful. You might want to consider negotiating that timeline, or maybe a better strategy is negotiating what like financial realities need to be in place to be deserving of an offer of ownership. A lot of folks going into private practice, they might say, well, can I get more base salary on day one? It's like, I mean, maybe, but if we can talk about ways to get you into ownership at 2 years instead of 3 years, if you're deserving of that, I mean, that might pay you like $500,000, $1 million more. Don't worry about the base salary. So, negotiation pieces here, like you got to work on, what is the future looking like?
Yeah. So let's take a step back before we drill even further into the ownership question. And let's say, because I'm sure if you're a very established physician, an experienced surgeon, and you're making a lateral move late into your career or even mid career, you have a lot more capital, literally, and also you can bring a lot more to a new practice. You have more to offer with, more to negotiate with. But let's say you're the new kid on the block, you're just starting out, you have all this potential, but nothing actualized yet, and you're going in to negotiate for your first job. um, Before we drill into specific things, maybe give us a sense of what are the real negotiables in an average contract. And I know everything's negotiable, but there's negotiable and then there's negotiable, right? So like what things more frequently do your clients find success negotiating over? And a pathway to ownership or a timeline to discuss that is certainly going to be one of them. What else are the big hitters where people actually can gain some ground a little bit, or move the needle when negotiating aspects of a contract?
Yeah, very good. So we really have three big questions of physician contracts. You got your work obligations, you got your compensation plan, and then you got exit strategy. Okay.
Hmm.
When we're in work obligations, that work location clause can trip a lot of folks up, especially in hospital employed positions. So if your employer says, hey, look, you are expected to work at hospital A, but we can make you work at hospital B, C, D, E, and F at any time. We've gotten a lot of success in limiting that flexibility on work location, call schedule, time off. All of those are in play. Okay, success on compensation. Okay, you're a neurosurgeon. Can you get more base salary on day one? Often. Okay, can you get more signing bonus? Yeah, probably moving stipend. Sure. Like those initial one off incentives, if they feel like they can get you in the door by giving you a little like 50 grand more up front, they'll often do that. Okay. Y'all are worth millions of dollars. Okay. Tens of millions of dollars. But is that really the most important thing? Okay. If you're in a hospital employed setting, the more important thing is going to be your work RV rates, your long term compensation per volume rates. So negotiating those is going to be more impactful. So if you're asking which ones are successful, negotiating those short term, rather cheap things can be very successful. But then the more impactful ones, which maybe are sometimes more difficult to negotiate, is more about long term comp. And then the last piece here is your exit strategy, making sure you have the ability to get out without losing your shirt, without, totally disrupting your life, kind of looking way into the future. If you want some freedom to renegotiate from a position of strength, you need to have established value, okay, making the employer money first. And then second, you need an exit strategy. You need to be able to take your value somewhere else, to take your talents to South Beach, right? So that's what you need. When you have established value as a trusted veteran, you're in the, Mike Wong space, then it's easier to renegotiate with new employers, right? In the next steps. So, as a first grad coming out of training, you're the prince, you're not the king yet, right? So you haven't established that value yet. That can be a bit of a limiting factor to getting a higher comp than someone who is 5 or 10 years out. But if you establish value quickly, you can start negotiating thoughtfully with like future comp renegotiations pretty quick.
Michael, I want to retain you immediately so I can talk to UM a little further about this. But I hope I hope our listeners are getting a sense of how complicated this is. So, what I took away from that, from the last two answers, and this is just my very limited view, is partnership carries with it responsibility and liability too, financial liability. This is how complicated these things get. That, and I had friends who had invested in things and they had to double down. They had to come up with cash when
Yes.
the business needed money, right? So it's not all about like, well, I'm getting the fruits of labor. I also get the decision making power and the consequences, right? So let me switch over now to academia, and I'm going to throw something at you because a lot of our folks come here and they're training, residency, fellowship. They're like, right now, by the way, we're in the thick of the beginning pre-interview season
Yeah.
for people who are looking for jobs. Now is the time. Like this is the time. The jobs are still open. And I always like to say that when you interview for a job, you always tend to think that you're the only one interviewing. That like, okay, I'm going to see if I like them, but they're actually interviewing lots of folks, right? Now, one of the things that I tell folks in our training program is like, maybe you should put together proposal. Okay, now like a business plan. Now this is a double-edged sword, right? And I want you to get into the weeds with this because especially in academia. So now you're dealing with an asymmetric situation. You're one person, they're a hospital system, university, and you say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to impress you with what I'm going to build, is usually what it looks like, right?
Right.
Good idea, bad idea. Does it commit them to resources? Does it commit you to what you have to deliver? Is it just a bunch of stuff on paper? What does it really mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say the prevailing method here is to not put forward like your proposal of what your practice is going to do. But I could see value if you have something specific that you have already demonstrated is valuable, something that you trained on, something specific about your background. And if you can write it out in a thoughtful way that will be able to make them money and bring them prestige and like meet their goals, then I don't see why that can't work. I think you have to have, a little bit of thoughtfulness about who you're presenting this to as well. Okay. Some folks just want to bring someone in that's going to do what they are told to do and really might not want someone who has their own specific plans and like practice goals and, research priorities and all that. Now, if those are your goals, then maybe you don't want to be at a practice that doesn't, respond well to what you are proposing. Um, but I would say it just depends on what you're looking to do.
I telegraphed that I have to bring up The Godfather, and obviously the offer that you can't refuse involves firearms that are not a good negotiating tactic for a long term fruitful business relationship. But it seems to me the way to successfully make an offer that a group you're trying to join or a hospital you're trying to join can't refuse is by understanding what they want. And so I know you represent physicians, but obviously through all these years and all these negotiations you've been through, you have to have some idea of what's going through the minds on the other side of the table. So can you give our listeners a sense of what the hospital is thinking when they're sitting across the table from you, or what the senior surgeon is actually looking for when they're sitting across and trying to read you across the table?
Yeah. Let's talk about like employer empathy. Okay. What are they concerned about in this deal? They want really two things. They want you to be productive because that's how they make money. Okay. They don't really make money by you being a wonderful surgeon. They make money by you doing a lot of work.
Hmm.
Okay. They want productivity. And then they also want stability. They don't want you to be able to turn over quickly. Okay. They want non competes, termination rights, other restrictions on your ability to easily leave them because it's incredibly difficult and expensive to recruit y'all. And it's even harder to replace y'all. So, AMA estimates it costs $500,000 to $1 million to replace a physician. Okay.
Wow.
Probably on the higher end for y'all. So when you're thinking about, okay, what are they concerned about? Their biggest concern is that either you're going to come in and not be very productive, okay, or that you're going to come in and be very productive and then take your value somewhere else. So that's kind of what they're looking at. And they know, so from a psych standpoint, they know that y'all, like folks coming out of training, love a big base salary and love a big signing bonus. Okay. So they're often open to negotiating those two things with you. So if the initial offer is 800, are they willing to go to 850 or 900? Maybe. Okay. That's not crazy. The opening signing bonus is 50 grand. Are they willing to go to 100 grand? Okay, maybe. If that's all it takes to get you in, like that is pretty cheap for them, frankly, compared to your value. Okay. But if you're thinking long term, those are some of the main points. I think that so we represent some smaller private practices in the firm. Okay, we don't represent Mega Health or private equity, but like smaller independent physician owned practices. And we talk to them about how to structure deals that make sense. This is what we're often talking about. Okay, long term, it's about your volume per compensation rates. Do you have enough here to make it profitable for you and entice the physician? If you win too hard as an employer, then your super valuable physician is going to get 2 or 3 years in, get a bunch of experience, get a background that shows that they can be super productive, and then go take that somewhere else and get a boatload more money from somebody else. Like, you don't want that. So, like, there's a bit of an equilibrium here. that I think employers are aware of and really should be aware of, that is in play. I think the thing that distorts that equilibrium is the consolidation in healthcare. Okay, all these massive systems buying each other out, creating mega groups. Often you'll have like a relatively large market that has only one or two players, and they both have non-competes that knock each other out. So like it ends up being where they don't have to compete locally. I think that these deals would get a lot better if the non-compete piece was worked on and it was a little bit easier to get in and out. But that's kind of the background for the employer's side, like making a deal you can't refuse. They often hold a little bit back on some of those initial shiny comp pieces to make you happy on the backside if they need to.
Michael, it's always struck me that doctors are super cheap, like stingy. And I don't know why that is. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons, but you think about it, like what you've been talking about to us for the last 20 minutes a day is like you're like Jerry Maguire. You're like the sports agent, right? And if I were a promising young football or basketball player, I suspect that I would pay my agent something between 15 and 25% of what I make, on contract to get good representation. Now, granted, those people, you're not going to carry our bags and all that and take us to the airport and fluff us up when we're lonely, but you represent us, and I think there's tremendous value. Like, people don't want to pay for the lawyer, but then you could make a difference to us in terms of 6 or even 7 figures, not only on the front end, but on the back end when things don't turn out right.
Yeah.
So tell us how to recognize, though, where the value is. In other words, let's say I have hired this lawyer or accountant or consultant to help me negotiate a job. Okay, how do I know that the guy's not doing or the gal's not doing their job, and I need to call you?
Yeah.
I need to trade out my agent for a better agent. How do we know when we're getting value? How do we know when we're kind of getting screwed over? Like, is there a way to tell? I imagine it is not like commoditized. I'm sure that you deliver a superior product to a lot of other folks, right?
Yeah. Look, it's about personal connection. Okay. If you develop a personal relationship with your lawyer, they know your contract, they know you, they help you negotiate, and they are there in the future when things inevitably become a question. That is where the real value lies. Okay. Give you an example from today. My entire day today was 4 former clients dealing with renegotiation issues about 2 to 4 years out. Okay. That was it. Okay. One was looking to leave an academic center and go to private practice and was trying to figure out, okay, Michael, teach me how private practice is going to be very, very different from my current deal. Like, what do I need to know when I have conversations with these folks? Okay. Another one was a hospital employed physician that we worked together 4 years ago. And there's a change in FTE status, change in exactly what they're doing. It's being dictated by the hospital, but he wanted to know, okay, what are my rights to push back? Can they actually do this without my consent? Or can I tell them no? Okay, that was our discussion. Few other pieces about like renegotiating comp. Employer wanted to reduce the like bonus structure in a comp package. We talked about what they can and can't do and what matches macro level comp norms and not. Okay, having someone to turn to in the future when you inevitably have some sort of issue is super duper valuable. Okay, we get this all the time. That's turning into probably half my practice at this point, 6 years in, is working on those deals. So that is where the value lies. The value also lies in clarity. Okay. It is not red lines in the contract. It is not saying, okay, I got this reviewed, so I can check that box on my list of things that I'm supposed to do as a resident. All right. It is really clearly understanding the pros and cons of this particular deal compared to others. No deal is perfect, but if you have clarity on, okay, I'm taking this deal because I like point A, B, and C, but there might be challenges on point D, E, and F in the future, having that clarity is super valuable. Getting an up or down, yes or no, is a contract good or bad, or comp is good or that doesn't help you. It's that clarity piece and that personal connection for future issues.
Great. Well, I obviously have to say I'm glad we got Jerry Maguire in the conversation. Uh, I, I guess when we have you back for part 3, we'll have to cover My Cousin Vinny, a personal favorite, and hopefully not the devil's advocate. I think that would make us the devils in that situation. So, but we'll keep the movie train going. But as we do come to an end, perhaps we could finish appropriately with the end of a contract. And we've talked a little bit about exit strategy, and obviously a lot of that's going to be covered when you negotiate your contract to begin with, and that stuff is in there. But perhaps as we wrap up, if you could talk a little bit about at the front end negotiating the exit strategy, but then also when the time comes, actually executing that, and if there's any room for, moving the goalposts a little bit or making things more suited to your actual situation with some negotiation tactics on the way out.
Yeah, very good. So on the front end, your exit strategy is your leverage for future compensation renegotiation. Okay. Non-compete is just not some esoteric issue. It comes into play when you are asking them 2 or 3 or 4 years in, if you're in hospital employed or in academics, hey, I want more money. They're going to be like, well, have you established value and can you leave? If the answer is yes and yes, now you have leverage. If either of those things are no, then you probably don't, frankly. Okay. Now on the back end, here's a common playbook for trying to renegotiate with your current employer. Okay. You start off with compensation console. It's usually about comp and renegotiations. Very difficult to renegotiate your non-compete in the future after you've established value. They have no interest in making it easier for you to leave them once you're already making them a bunch of money. Okay, so it's often about comp. You really can't negotiate exit strategy very much outside of your first contract, like your initial contract with that employer. Okay, so you're talking about comp. You need to get a comp console so you understand the data. We worked on that in the last podcast. You make a comp request. Let's say they say no. Okay. But you want to make more money. You're underpaid. You want to advocate for yourself. If you have a good exit strategy, I encourage you to interview with other places, consider other offers, negotiate those deals, something that you could reasonably take, okay, that you're excited to potentially take. Okay. Now, at that point, okay, before I say this, like, this is not legal advice. You should consult your own lawyer. Like, disclaimer, okay, don't take this one podcast as your, only thing that you do, okay? But
Right.
This is what we commonly do in the firm. So you have a deal that you are ready to sign, okay? You submit your notice of termination to the employer, okay? You say, I am leaving. However, if you do X, Y, and Z, I'm open to staying. At that point, you will now know whether they can do the thing or not. You would be amazed at the number of things I can get pushed through within 48 hours after submitting a notice of termination. Okay. Now, if they don't answer and they don't say yes to those things, and you got to be prepared to sign that other contract and go. Okay. So no bluffing here. You got to be willing to take it all the way to the river. Okay. But if you're willing to do that, then you can often really push through some stuff. Now, a lot of these employers, especially at hospitals, they play hardball all the time. They're a half click below mafia anyways, okay? I don't think you're really going to, like, burn that many bridges from negotiating hard here, okay? Like, they do this all the time, okay? So I encourage you to not be shy about that. Get some advice, okay? Get consult with a lawyer that knows what they're doing in the space, that has done this multiple times, so they can help guide you through the process. But if you're a few years out and you're considering that, then yeah, that's where you want to be.
A small follow-up to double click on one part of that. I feel that, you say you have another offer, you take it to the point where there's a contract that's ready to sign, and then you go to your boss and you say, look what they're willing to do, and they meet all your demands. The other group may feel jilted, right? And so obviously that's going to be an issue. You maybe burn that bridge a little bit. How do you handle that conversation? And how often are they willing to accept it's not personal, it's just business, or do you have to be strategic about burning that bridge?
You do have to be strategic about it. And look, like, healthcare is a dirty business, all right? Like, there's a lot of moving parts here. Are they going to be upset with you? Have you probably burned a bridge with that particular employer in the future? Probably, often. Okay. A lot of these employers, though, like, especially if they're big ones, like, the person you negotiated with might be gone or might be in a different role in 5 years. Like, they don't have, it's not like me. I own this one law firm. Like, I'm going to remember it for the next 40 years. Often with them,
Grinding your axe.
Yeah, I'll do this until I die, hopefully. So, but often that gets a little bit maybe oversold. After a time, maybe that's not as big of an issue. But yeah, you got to be prepared to ruffle some feathers and maybe have some folks unhappy with you. But look, if it's important, and we're talking about your family, your total comp, your future, doing the thing that you want to do, it's important. I don't mind helping folks negotiate aggressively.
Got it. Well, the website, michaeljohnsonlegal.com, the Instagram, Physician Contracts, the man himself, Michael Johnson, JD. Thank you for returning to the show and giving us, I guess, Physician Contracts 201 negotiations. We look forward to part 3, which I guess will be, I don't know, starting a firm for your own. But for now, hey, there's something there. But for now, thanks for coming back on the show and joining us on the Neurosurgery Podcast.
Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.